So I have a passion for mecha. I mean, ever since my father exposed a baby Eien to the original Transformers cartoon as a child, I've been enamored with the idea of giant robots slamming into each other and turning each other into scrap metal. Since then, I have expanded my horizons quite a bit, but the mecha genre, and sci-fi more broadly, has always been at my center. I consider Gurren Lagann to be one of, if not my favorite piece of fiction ever written. I like Titanfall and the Zone of the Enders games, and other anime I like include Code Geass, Evangelion, and of course, Aldnoah Zero. Out of 10! However, I recognize that most of the things that I love and adore wouldn't exist if not for one of the great granddaddies of the genre. The original Mobile Suit Gundam. Created by Yoshiyuki Tomino, Kidou Senshi Gundam, otherwise known as Mobile Suit Gundam in the West, was first released in 1979 by a fledgling Sunrise studio. The story follows the perpetually whiny Amuro Ray and a ragtag group of teenagers as they are forced to pilot giant robots to fight the Principality of Zeon, Nazi-like space colonists led by the Zabi family, and Zeon's resident smug ass-kicker, Char Aznable. While the show was not initially successful, having its 50-episode run cut down to 43 episodes, the series would stay alive as a result of reruns and Gunpla model kits, toys modeled after the mechs of the series. As a result of its Star Trek-esque success, Tomino was given the opportunity to adapt his series into 3 movies. These movies would skyrocket Gundam into the eyes of the Japanese public, with the show being given several sequels, spin-off timelines, model kits, video games, novels, model kits, manga, more model kits, and even a terrible live-action movie. But perhaps its crowning achievement was that it effectively established what would become known as the realistic robot, or real robot, genre of mecha. Seriously, guys, just don't watch G-Savior. It's just terrible. It's not even funny. Just don't do it. It's bad. Just stop. I often tell people that Gundam is perhaps one of the most important anime to ever exist, and that it is good watching material for any anime fan who respects and wants to understand the medium. Of course, the young anime fans of today have taken a very polarized stance towards Gundam, and mecha in general. But whenever I ask why, they simply don't respond or give the stereotypical "I don't like mecha" response, which I personally find incredibly close-minded. So today, I want to touch upon why Mobile Suit Gundam is great. But I'm not going to be looking at it from a story perspective per se. I'm going to tackle 2 of the more important elements of the iconic mecha series. Firstly, the historical references and influences the show has, specifically towards the Second World War, and secondly, to observe the cultural aftershock of the show and the impact of the show on the medium. Keep in mind that most of this will pertain to the original Mobile Suit Gundam, which is also referred to as 0079, and the series that exists in its timeline, the Universal Century. This includes Zeta Gundam, Double Zeta Gundam, Char's Counterattack, the 8th MS Team, Stardust Memory, War in the Pocket, etc., etc. It's not like there's some alternate universes that aren't good, though some of them aren't. I just don't want to be here all day. So to start, let's jump a bit back in time. The Pacific War. It's an image burnt to the national identity of the Japanese people and its surrounding nations. It both wreaked havoc upon the land of the rising sun and would forever ostracize it from the rest of the Asian populace. Japan would take many years to come to terms with its actions during the war, and one of the ways it did was by exploring the war through fiction. Yoshiyuki Tomino was born in Odawara in 1941. When he was 4 years old, bombs would be dropped over his city, just as the Showa Emperor would call for Japan's unconditional surrender. Growing up in the post-war age, Tomino was heavily influenced by the post-war sentiment that Japan was a victim in a war that they started. Tomino would become aware of the truth of Japan's war in the Pacific, and would become deeply disturbed by it, which comes off in the duality of both the Earth Federation and the Principality of Zeon in Mobile Suit Gundam. A major theme of Gundam is the repetitive nature of war, and how humanity tends to never learn from its mistakes, justifying its historical influences. Watching 0079, I think it becomes fairly obvious that the factions of the One-Year War have some uncanny parallels to the factions of World War II. The Earth Federation is representative of the Allies, a group of nations united against an authoritarian threat. That threat would be known as the Principality of Zeon, a nation operating under the guise of justice, stylized after the Third Reich. From their uniforms to the fact that the Zeon flag is basically the Nazi war flag, Tomino very much wanted to parallel the fascist state. Heck, the phrase Sig Zeon is an obvious homage to Sig Heil, the phrase which accompanied the Nazi salute. But all of this Nazi symbolism was just that, Nazi symbolism. It was all a clever ruse for what Tomino actually wanted to talk about: imperialist Japan. For those of you familiar with Japanese history, consider the events which eventually produced the Principality of Zeon. Zeon would split with the Federation under the pretense of how people born in the colonies were treated unfairly compared to those born on Earth. Similarly, Japan would separate from the League of Nations under the pretense of not being considered equal with the rest of the nations in the alliance. The Republic of Munzo, the state replaced by the Principality of Zeon, falls with the death of Zeon Zum Daikun at the hands of people with militaristic ambitions. This parallels the events in the 1930s of Japan, where far-right officers in the Japanese military would carry out assassinations and rebellions, such as the death of Japanese Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi, or the 226 incident. As a result, different far-right politicians and generals would be able to seize power in the Japanese army, not unlike how the Zabis used the death of Daikun to create a military dictatorship and renamed it the Principality of Zeon. Consider as well the economic situation of these nations. Zeon, a group of space colonies far from Earth with resources 30 times less than the Federation, ruled by fascist dictators and a monarch. 1930s Japan, a group of islands far from the rest of the Earth, with incredibly strained resources, ruled by fascist dictators and a monarch. Even in later Gundam series, the idea of Zeon being strained for resources and needing other colonies to prosper continues to persist, just like how Japan needed Manchuria and Korea in order to continue prospering. Gundam Unicorn expands on this, with the Neo-Zeon faction referencing the need for a space colony co-prosperity sphere, a term that harkens back to the White Scare in Japan in the 1930s, and Japan's excuse for building a Pacific empire. In addition, dates in the Universal Century timeline line up with key events during the Pacific War. The date Daeguan Soto Zabi formally declares himself the leader of Zeon is the day that Japan surrendered to the Americans, August 15th. Perhaps the most notable of the dates is September 18th, the date where the events of the first episode of 0079 start, with Shah Aznavold and a group of Zeon soldiers infiltrating Side 7 to find the Earth Federation's Project V. In the East, September 18th is well known as the date of the Mukden incident, where a group of Japanese soldiers used a bombing as an excuse to formally invade Manchuria. There are a couple other smaller nods made to the war in the Pacific that are kind of disparate, so I'll talk about them now. The expression, space for the space noids, parallels the Imperial Japanese slogan, Asia for the Asians. The technologies and tactics used in the One-Year War, such as colony drops and experimental mobile suit divisions, are meant to parallel the devastation of the atomic bombs and the Japanese human experimentation divisions respectively. The Solomon Island base, the stronghold for Zeon's Chancellor Giran Zabi, is named after the Solomon Islands, where the Battle of Guadalcanal took place. Even the title of this show is a reference to the war. In Japanese, the show is called Kido Senshi Gundam, or Mobile Warrior Gundam, a name that parallels a unit in the Imperial Japanese Army called the Kido Butai, the aircraft carrier task force, best known for being the frontrunners on the attack of Pearl Harbor. The name carries a lot of weight and a lot of symbolism to those who remember the war from only 3 decades prior. While the historical parallels of Gundam are interesting, and one of the main reasons the multi-billion yen franchise got traction, its effect on Japanese culture after release cannot be understated. Let me put it this way. Did you ever own a figurine of an anime character ever? If you answered yes, then you have Gundam to thank. Or more specifically, the Gunpla boom in the 80s. 0079's success over time is directly caused by the kids buying all the plastic models associated with the series. And when the movies hit, and when Zeta Gundam hit, Gunpla exploded. Pretty soon afterward, there were Gundam kits everywhere in Japan, owned by both children and older men, giving rise to Japanese otaku culture. And Gundam's success would directly influence Sunrise's competitors, contemporaries, and other artists. Shoji Kawamori, the creator of Macross and the character designer of the Transformers, directly credits Gundam as an influence in his work. The design of Optimus Prime's face was made to directly parallel the RX-78-2 of Gundam, and the political intrigue of Macross and the themes of transcending cultural boundaries are inspired by those found in Gundam. And if you want to talk influences, there's a reason that old-school anime nerds like myself use the term Char clone. The rivalry between Char and Amuro in the original Gundam series has become so popular that it's disseminated throughout Japanese culture. Basically, every rival character who's edgy, charismatic, wears a color that contrasts the protagonist, and or wears a mask is directly influenced by the Red Comet himself. From Griffith of Berserk, to Zero of Mega Man X, to Silver Mask from Arslan. Sunrise makes sure to throw Char clones in every Gundam timeline, and has even messed with the formula several times, with Lelouch of Code Geass or Vidar of Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans being two notable subversions of the Char clone tropes. Opposed to the concept of the Char clone is the reluctant anime protagonist trope, best exemplified in 0079 with main character Amuro Ray. This character tends to come up in mecha shows, particularly in the early 80s, with a revival in the late 90s. The eventual poster boy for this trope would become Shinji Ikari, protagonist of Neon Genesis Evangelion, and the character who would revive the reluctant anime hero archetype. Hideaki Anno, Evangelion's creator, and a well-known fan of the Gundam series, was upset with the direction that companies, including his own employer Gainax, had made, with their protagonists being more hot-blooded. In fact, a lot of things Gundam did became staples of the real robot genre, namely because they created it. Conflict in most of these shows tends to revolve around humans or humanoids, and the moral gray that the war tends to have. A lot of these shows tend to focus on space, the colonization of space, and the socio-political effects of colonization. And many of these shows tend to focus on the ways to transcend and work towards bettering humanity. They tend to speak to a higher purpose of some sort, and don't handle material with a good versus bad mentality. Because everyone in war tends to think that they're on the right side of history, and typically don't self-examine before shooting their enemies in the face. In essence, this video is me exploring Japan and its cultural history, before and after Gundam. The original series was a cultural touchstone, which speaks volumes about post-war Japan, and irrefutably influenced its landscape. I think a lot of people today don't see the value in shows like it, in the same way people see shows like Jojo, where it's not just something you watch. Gundam is something you have to think about for a while. Granted, I am hopeful. I think as a whole, the franchise is starting to pick up traction again, thanks to the efforts of shows like Iron-Blooded Orphans and Gundam Unicorn. And to be fair, the Gundam community isn't exactly welcoming in the West. Perhaps what I'm trying to say is, I just want people to appreciate the original show for what it is, what it's inspired by, and what it became. I just touched on two of the peripheral reasons of why I think the show is important, but there are plenty of other reasons inside the show. There's a greater meaning behind it and all the other Gundam works that Tobe worked on. It speaks to the struggles of war, adolescence, racism, patriotism, and everything in between. But most of all, I think these shows speak to hope, to possibility, and the transcendental values that all humanity holds dear. But it's up to you to find those things for yourself. I can only talk about these things. It's a daunting task, I know. I've figuratively been in those shoes before. But if you are ready to question, to wonder, to think, and to dream about something greater than yourself, then it's a journey you won't regret. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, or if you found it mildly interesting, I'd suggest leaving a like below. I'd also ask that if you have something interesting to add to the conversation, to leave a comment. This video took a lot of research, and I'm pretty sure I covered it all, but you can never be too sure. I'd also like to give shoutouts to an essay in Imagining the War in Japan, representing and responding to trauma in post-war literature and film, by William Ashbaugh, on Mobile Suit Gundam and Space Battleship Yamato. This essay is one of the main reasons why I chose to do this video. Thanks again for tuning in. This is Aaron, signing off.